I never described myself as the guy to talk to about Azure DevOps, but actually pretty nice. So thanks for that. And to my audience, thank you for showing up. I was honestly a bit surprised when Luke approached me to talk about Azure DevOps, knowing that the focus of the user group is .NET to the core, where my assumption was that developers already know everything about .NET, and besides that, everything about using Azure DevOps. But apparently there was still quite some interest, so thanks for that. So it's not about me, but for the ones who don't know that much, like Luke mentioned, been working in IT for about 25 years and shifted to Azure about 7, 8 years with a background in building Microsoft data centers. Not a developer at all, but I somehow find out that once you start moving workloads to the cloud, whenever it's not building virtual machines anymore, it typically means that you need to pick up some developer notions, and that's how I describe myself, and heavily working with Azure DevOps in meantime. In my day-to-day job within Microsoft, I'm providing readiness workshop training to customers and partners all over the world. Used to be EMEA only up till beginning this year when we weren't allowed to travel anymore. And since then, it switched to virtual training. So if my voice breaks up every now and then, it's because I've been delivering way too many workshops back to back, I guess, and my voice started, uh, yeah, suffering a little bit from that. But we got the holidays coming up, so got some time to recover. So with that, let's see how far we can get in talking about DevOps. I'm typically providing 40-hour weeks on something DevOps related, so squeezing this in 45 minutes could be a little bit tight. And I want to make sure that if you have any questions, we can take those all the way at the end as well. Now, for the ones who are totally new to DevOps, it's an interesting world, I would say. And even looking at my personal background, I always assumed like DevOps, although it has some ops in the terminology, I always thought like it's something for developers. And the reason why is because for a long time, they were talking about Agile, talking about Scrum, something that myself as an IT pro, I never really worried about. Like it's developer oriented and it's nothing for me, right? But in reality, it's actually helping you forward. I mean, not just to cloud, but since we're mainly focusing on Azure these days, it's dramatically helping you moving workloads to the cloud because it means that you need to be faster in delivery, you need to fix issues and bringing teams together. And that's in short what DevOps literally stands for. So it's not a product, it's not a tooling, it's more like a concept. And for a lot of organizations, it's also a mindset where before, and that's the traditional way of describing like how not to operate, but we've all been doing that and we all know our own environments or customer scenarios where you got a developer team, you have an operations team, and they somehow never work together, right? Where now you need to integrate security, you need to integrate your architect team, you need to integrate the project managers, and all that is literally what DevOps stands for. Optimizing, bringing teams together, working towards a more streamlined process, and delivering return of investment for the organization. Next to that, it scares a lot of organizations like we are not the Facebooks, the Netflixes, the Twitters of this world. And the misconception is that once you start, or you're even thinking about starting using DevOps, that you need to do everything. Or that once you start, for example, using Azure DevOps, hopefully after some convincing demos throughout the session, that you go like, well, it's pretty complete as a product, and we're never ready to do that. It's like a one-time shot, but it's not, because in reality, it's a continuous journey. You start, you could take some baby steps out of the developers integrating with your trusted environments. Out of the operations team, you start integrating, for example, Azure templates, PowerShell scripts, Azure CLI scripts. And even although I mentioned Azure like 17 times already, it's nothing about Azure specific. So nothing would block you from using a DevOps mindset, a DevOps concept to optimize your on-prem software lifecycle deployments. Moving to cloud obviously is going to help you, but it's not like a given that you can only start practicing DevOps if you start moving to cloud. Now, a bit more about the process itself. And maybe for some of you explaining some of the typical DevOps keywords that typically show up. So first of all, it's a continuous motion, which is easily described as a continuous flow, right? Now, when you think about your workload that you want to run somewhere on-prem, in the cloud, in any cloud, doesn't matter, you start with thinking about what do we want to run? Like using COVID as a somehow easy example, maybe you were running some kind of restaurant, maybe a small shop, and you didn't really worry about e-commerce because everybody was literally passing by. Well, now you need to start shifting your business. And the easy example could be, I need some kind of a web shop. I need to publish a website and I need to inform customers whenever I'm like opening up my restaurant or my shop and giving them some opportunity to start ordering. But where do I get started? So you need to integrate your developers. You're going to reach out to some system architect, like what is the platform I need to use? And that's the planning phase. From there, you start validating. So developers start working, sysadmins start working, building servers, building network components. And that's what we call the build phase. Once it's built, as good developers, you probably can confirm that testing and validation is also important. And eventually you produce a package, like a web deploy package for a website, or maybe some ARM templates, or anything that again helps you in running your scenarios. From there, you're going to run a deployment, which means we're going to run it or move it in some kind of running state, which by itself doesn't always mean moving to production. You're just going to test it, you're going to validate, but this time you're going to run it in a cloud-ready environment or a somehow production-ready environment, where the previous validation and testing typically happens on your sysadmin's workstation or your development environment. And then once it's running, you deployed it, it's running. That's where typically the ops comes back in the picture, where you start monitoring your environment. There's some maintenance going on. Looks a bit weird, but anyway. So monitoring maintenance and validating that your environment is still running. And then a lot of different things could happen from there. Maybe you pick up some new functionality that you want to integrate, or maybe you find out that whenever you want to deploy something, you first need to make some changes in your platform, or you figure out that you got a pretty successful online business and you need to go back to the architect table. Like, how can I figure out to run my application, not just for the 300 customers every day, but maybe 3,000? What's the impact? And that's, again, that continuous flow. So from here, out of the monitoring the maintenance, we're going to inform the architects, the developers. They're going to build a new version of the app. They're going to test it again. And we're going to build out version 2.0, deploying it again, monitoring. And that's what we keep repeating from here. So that's in short what the DevOps flow actually stands for. And that brings me to Azure DevOps, just one of the so many tools, and immediately sharing some, again, new misconceptions. Although Azure DevOps has Azure in the name, it's not limiting you to deploying anything different from an Azure cloud environment. If you want to use it against your on-prem infrastructure, if you want to deploy resources on AWS, Google Cloud, any environment, it doesn't even matter anymore. Now, in short, going back to that concept around my continuous flow, bringing teams together, it also means that you have different tools that you need to bring together. So Azure DevOps gives you a lot of different capabilities, starting with Azure Boards. That's what I describe as the project management. And it allows you to literally bring your teams together and finding out what the teams are working on. From there, you could integrate with Azure Repos. It's our Git compatible source control, which allows you to bring different developers together and sharing code using traditional Git comments, so the check-in, check-out commits, pull requests, everything that's Git standard, I would say, is supported. And it's, again, not the only option. If you, for example, use Git or GitHub or GitLab or any other source control scenario that somehow recognizes Git as the standard protocols, it's going to allow you to integrate with Azure DevOps, but for example, not using Azure repos. And then last, probably one of the other core components, and I'll try to walk you through some demos, is building pipelines. Now, what is a pipeline? It's a little bit simplified in a way explained is a sequence of tasks. Like this could be a sequence of PowerShell scripts, Azure CLI scripts, or other languages, or pushing out your application source code. And if you want, you could actually combine all of that together. So back to the DevOps, buzzwords if you want. It's typically described as a CI/CD pipeline. Now, what is CI/CD? It stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. And it somehow fits in our diagram where continuous integration happens on typically the left side of the scoping, where you have developers checking in code, testing it out, bringing in new functionality, feature flags, and anything else in the applications. And at the same time, you have your operations team bringing in ARM templates, Terraform templates, infrastructure as code, deployment scripts in any language you could think of, and testing it, validating it. But from there, you're going to move to, or at least that's the plan. What happens to my, I can't write anymore. That ain't nice. This is still working. Good. Nope, pen is done. No more writing on the whiteboard. That's fine. I just needed to add CD on there. So that's a continuous deployment, which allows you to, whenever a developer or an operations person checks in code, committing the changes, that you're going to pick up that pre-automated process. And from there, publishing new code and having a new version of the website, a new database flavor running. That's the idea. And again, continuously repeating the same process thanks to those pipelines. And then some sub sections in Azure DevOps, test plans, allowing you to build out your user functional testing, smoke testing, platform testing, whatever you could think of before, again, you're going to push it out and running it. And then artifacts is the integration with, for example, packages. If you think about, since you're the .NET Core user group, I think you're quite familiar with NuGet packages or NPM for Node or Maven for Java apps or anything else, where you could, again, share the packages, the artifacts in Azure Artifacts and handing them over to your development team, where instead of having every developer connecting to the public repos and grabbing packages, you could control it, streamline it, or even from a security perspective, blocking developers from grabbing publicly available packages and forcing them to use the library of packages that you offer out of your DevOps environment. And then even, more important, I would say, about the nice openness, the integration with other tools. So if you look at a lot of popular tools, I talked about Azure Boards as the project management solution. If you look at the .NET world and even broader than .NET, you typically bump into a tool called Jira. It's a project management tool, again, for developers, and in meantime, stretching out to the DevOps teams. And nothing blocks you from continuously using Jira and moving to Azure pipelines only, and maybe not even using artifacts, or maybe using some other third-party tool, and still gluing everything together thanks to connections in Azure DevOps. Or Git and GitHub, the nicest example, I would say, where you have the source code in your private or public GitHub, could be GitHub server on-prem, and from there picking up code and automating the deployments, again, using Azure pipelines. So that's all nice to know. We're going to share the recording, so spend some time on reading a bit more about the details and showing you in quick and easy how you can get started. So yes, obviously, I'm going to use Azure as my starting point and eventually also my ending point, where the ultimate idea that we do have a little web app and we want to push it out and running it on our Azure platform and end-to-end automating it. Now, the first option, if you're totally new to, I would say, DevOps in general and not even using Azure DevOps because it might be a little bit overwhelming at first, from within your Azure portal, you can use DevOps Starter. Now, what is DevOps Starter? It's allowing you to already pick up the CI/CD concepts and everything around DevOps I already talked about without the overwhelming integration from Azure DevOps. So depending on your language, if it's a .NET app or Node app, perfectly fine. Golang is also available here. So you start with, I'm going to use .NET. Or even if you have some other code that you want to integrate, that's also an option. Let's say we're using .NET Core. Since I'm talking for the .NET Core user group, how fancy can demos become, right? Running it on Windows, let's do Linux because .NET Core runs on Linux, where you provide a name, the .NET Core Demo 1. In my DevOps environment, I don't have a project yet that's called .NET Core Demo. I'm going to publish a web app and let's deploy it closer to my region, somewhere Europe, West Europe. And that's it. So from here, I typically don't need to do anything. It's going to prep everything from the Azure resources. It's going to create an Azure DevOps project. And from there, I can start working, publishing code, ARM templates, everything else. Or not. No idea why not. Directory object quota limit. Nice. I love doing live demos. Eventually, it should have worked perfectly fine. No idea why I reached the limit. Probably did way too many demos around service principles, but nothing to worry about for now. At least I hope. So from here, I'm moving into my Azure DevOps world. If you need to create Azure DevOps for the first time from scratch, you connect to dev.azure.com, you sign in with your Azure admin credentials, and from there you can start creating a project. And the mindset is that you would create one single project for all projects you're working on or all software publishing scenarios you're working on, or you could split them up based on the project itself, based on the application. Like in my case, I got most of them are obviously demos that I'm going to walk you through. Something with Terraform that I can show you later on. My e-commerce platform is already waiting to be used. Integration with Key Vault, so a lot of the traditional scenarios that you might already know from Azure can easily be integrated. And just to keep my environment a little bit lean and mean, I would say, I'm creating separate projects. Next to that, you can specify specific permissions, like who can interact with the project, which means that obviously part of your development team, part of your ops team could work on one project, but not seeing anything from another project. That's the main idea. So I already prepped a meetup project place, and this one is obviously waiting to be used. I pushed in some repo information. Now it tells me that it cannot find it anymore. Why not? Because one of my developers wasn't really using it in the correct way, but nothing blocks me from creating new repos linked to one project or linked to multiple projects. So let's create a new one. We're going to make it Git compatible, which means that we can continue using like Git command integration or Git desktop, or moving it into like a Visual Studio integration. And this will be my .NET Core demo repo. So it's creating a placeholder. It's creating an interesting markdown README file, and I'm going to clone it to my local machine, where depending on your environment, could be Visual Studio Code, could be Visual Studio. Let me take one step back, if it allows me to. Oh no, I broke it. Fine, then we're going to do Visual Studio Code. There we go. And giving it a little bit of time. And if all works as it should be, it should start integrating some DevOps magic. Come on, VS Code, you can do this. And defining where on our local machine we want to store information. Thank you for reminding me. I guess most of you are familiar with VS Code already, so it's your trusted environment, and just integrating that Azure DevOps repos is nothing different from the way you've been using it before. So I have my source environment, but obviously there's nothing really in there for now. And let's create a new file. And this is my, let's call it the PDT docs. I'm going to save it as a markdown for one of my friends later on. Now, what's going to happen here is that out of that integrated Git source control, it's detecting that something happened on my source environment. From here, I could, again, make changes and eventually assume that this is my project. I'm going to commit. And I need to provide some explanation. And again, if you're familiar with Git, no rocket science here. This is my initial demo file. So from here, it's updating all the changes, nothing's pending anymore. And it means we can check back in our repos environment and nothing's happening. But I'm not as worried as before. Why not? Because this is, again, some other nice integration, a little bit of a safety net where I committed my changes, but they're not immediately pushing back to the server. Now it's a setting in VS Code that you can change that whenever you perform a commit, that it's automatically pushing. I never trust myself, so I'm not doing it. And from here, I'm going to force the changes. Down here, it's running around a little bit, almost looks like my DevOps whiteboard diagram. And everything's in sync. If you want, again, back to some Git concepts, if you're familiar with branching, with pull requests, everything can be integrated from here. I'm currently working with a main branch because I only have one. But from here, I could create a new one, the demo branch. It's again all happening on my local machine. I could commit again and making changes and taking it forward. Now, if all goes fine, there should be a commit. So this was the original one, thanks to Azure DevOps. And this is my commit where I can pull up my initial demo. And it's also keeping track of the changes. So let me go back and make some changes here, making some changes. I'm quickly doing this in a markdown file. Obviously, if this is your .NET project, would be the exact same thing. But I don't want to bore you with .NET language because you already work with that all day. That's what Luke told me. So update it to version 1.0. And once more, forcing the changes. And eventually it will show up here again and showing me the changes as well. So that's in short what the repos are doing. Now it's not, I would say, too exciting about a markdown file. So let me switch to one of my prepped environments. So what I'm doing here is picking up source code, little, actually not a little, a pretty big .NET Core application where I'm using a web front end. Got my W root in there, my Teams folder. I can move to my, oh, actually was good. User content, some product images for my website. I should actually move those to Azure Blobs, but I haven't really done that yet. But that's my my source code. There we go. Some HTML start pages and anything else that we need to have our full application up and running. Where again, from here, there's a little bit more happening. So I got my original commits. I got some other commits from other colleagues working on the same project. I can see the branching. I can see the merging. So the full history of what my team has been working on is there. Now from here, we can interact with actually deploying something. So what we have till now is just our source code, and we didn't really did anything different from a bunch of developers working together, sharing code. So now we're going to take it one step further and moving it to a running state. Now I'm immediately jumping to a release pipeline. Not that important if you start with build release, because if you look at some other tools, they just talk about pipelines. Even GitHub Actions, one of the newer, I would say, DevOps tools in the family, are just talking about creating pipelines. Now, maybe some of you have some backlogging, some history with Visual Studio Team Services, or maybe even longer time ago, TFS, Team Foundation Server. And it's obviously the backlog of Azure DevOps if you want. And we're still using a mixed world. So I always described it as the benefit of working with Microsoft tooling, that in a lot of scenarios, using a GUI, you can just find your way around and it starts working. And once you're becoming a little bit more experienced, you could move to the coding stage where mapping it with Azure, nothing would block you from deploying something out of the Azure portal. But if it becomes a bit more serious, more deployments, you're going to move to ARM templates, you're going to move to Terraform, you're going to move to PowerShell CLI. And that's where it becomes a little bit more coding alike. And we can do the exact same thing with our DevOps environment. So from here, and I'm going to try to show you live, but I got my fallback scenario if needed. We're going to create a new pipeline. So it starts with two different scenarios. The first one is using the older, therefore we call it classic, and that's using the graphical interface. It's literally clicking around, finding what you need, and it's going to work. So our source control is Azure repos. But again, if you have Git, GitHub Enterprise on-prem, or any other Git compatible source control, is perfectly fine. This is my project. This is my repository, and I'm going to use the master branch. And I'm building a .NET application that eventually I want to run on Azure, but I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to run build and testing. Remember, out of my DevOps diagram, I don't trust myself, so I'm going to validate everything I'm doing. Out of the source control, we define that it's a .NET application, and without doing anything, it's picking up a template where I'm going to run through the traditional developer flow. I'm going to grab my NuGet packages. That's what I need for compiling my .NET app. I'm going to run .NET NuGet restore. I'm going to build, and for now, I'm not going to waste my time on testing. I trust my code. I'm not going to publish anything, but I'm going to publish my artifacts, and that's literally creating like a web deployed package, similar to the right-click publish create package in Visual Studio a long time ago. The demo pipeline or anything else. From here, I can define where I want to run my pipeline. So Azure DevOps gives you two scenarios using Azure build servers. It's a unique server for each and every pipeline iteration. Or if you don't want to use public cloud servers, or you have some specifics and you want to build your customized servers, or you want to keep everything on-prem, you could also use your own build servers for that. Next, since I'm using my Azure public build servers, depending on the platform I'm using for my language, I can choose different build servers. Interesting if you want to test applications moving from .NET 3.1 to like a .NET 5. And let's give it a push and see what's happening. So it starts reaching out to the Azure DevOps build agent backend. Again, it's a unique server for each and every iteration. At the end of the pipeline run, it's going to remove all the specifics. Next time I'm running the build, it's connecting to a different server. So it's actually quite cool and easy solution. You don't need to worry about anything. So it picked up NuGet version 4.4.1. If your application is, for example, the newest one, .NET 5, then out of the box, this is not going to work anymore because the 4.4.1 NuGet is not recognizing .NET 5. And I guess that's what's blocking me here from updating it. So what it tells me is a lot of details. And obviously, most important is like trying to find out like where did it go wrong. And it doesn't look that nice, like red and black, but it's going to tell me like, oh, version 3.1 of the .NET Core SDK, yada, 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 is not available. So that was literally what I was already talking about. So we go back to our pipeline. Gonna make a little change. And from here, I got two options. So I used a little outdated framework, I guess. So I could switch to server 19, running it again, and it's gonna work. But I really wanted to show you like how easy that troubleshooting can be. Or I could move into 4.4.1 and defining this as use NuGet 5.8, making some changes here, saving and queuing, and running it again. So from here, nothing's really changing. It's gonna provide you the exact same output. And let me switch back to one of the previous running pipelines where I used compile web app package. It's complaining about some .NET behavior similar to the output debugging in Visual Studio, VS Code, or any other development environment you have. But eventually the compile steps were successful. So I was using at that time, at least, the same source control. Using 4.1 worked fine. NuGet restore, showing you all the steps that's happening in the backend. It's going to run Git, copying all the source code from your environment into the build server. From there, compiling it, where again, the full flow comes in. And showing you again where I started that a pipeline is nothing more than just a sequence of tasks. Somewhere in here, it's grabbing all the code, validating it. And I don't want to spend too much time, but somewhere there should be like a .NET run, .NET build. I told you it's a pretty big project, so that's why there's quite a lot. But I can go back all the way to the end. And this is a pipeline I ran like a couple of weeks back, and I still have that history. So even if I now move to new code, developers are checking in new code, and all of a sudden it's not working anymore, then I can easily go back to a previous state and allowing me to compile it in a successful one. Now, let's say we want to move to containers. I need to talk about containers at least once, right? So we go back to our pipelines. I'm going to create a new one. I could again do classic. I'm not going to run it again, but just showing you how intuitive it is. Where this time I can do some Docker integration, build and publish a Docker container. That's what we need. And what it's allowing me here is defining again a sequence of tasks. So it's starting from .NET source control, and the first task is build an image. Next to that, it's trying to help me already and assuming that I'm going to move something to Azure Container Registry, or again, another registry, not that important. You complete all the settings, you provide some names, some variables, and you're good to go. And I'll show you the output of that in a minute. But last is the non-classic scenario. By the way, I'm going to cancel this, or it's going to block me later on because I can only run one at a time and I don't want to wait for this one. Well, now I can do the same, but not using the classic editor. So my source is Azure repos or any other environment. It's still the same repo. And based on the source code that I have, it's again trying to help me a little bit and identifying what I want to do. So I want to build ASP.NET, and without doing anything too much, it's going to pick up some default settings. Now from here, typically you need to make some changes, but at least we give you a starting point. So it picks up in line 10 that I'm going to use Windows latest. That's the YAML code to identify version Windows 2019 for the build agent. It's picking up my Visual Studio solution. And in step 17 or line 17, it's picking up the different tasks. Task 1, NuGet tool installer. That's the same thing as I showed you in Classic, where it's going to pick up the NuGet tool, downloading it inside that build agent. Next, it's going to run NuGet command. And NuGet command means I'm going to run the NuGet restore. Next, it's going to run a task called VS build. And what it does is picking up the solution using that $ variable, because I already defined it on line 13. If you look up, I could add some arguments where I'm going to publish to a package defining my build platform, and eventually I'm going to run VS testing. From here, if you want, you could start mixing the different worlds together. So what you can do is reusing all the tasks, all the templates that we made available in Classic, and allowing you to migrate between the two worlds. So if I want to run, let's say all the way at the beginning or somewhere up here, I want to integrate a .NET Core step where this time I'm going to do .NET Restore, and my path is something like this, and I can add some integration, use the packages from my artifacts that I already have, and I don't want you to use the public ones, and so on and so on. I'm going to save it. I'm not going to run it. The commit is PDT made some changes, although I don't have to identify PDT because obviously the system already knows who I am. And from here, it should give me a new pipeline. No idea where it disappeared, but that's fine. It's a YAML file. So let's take it one step further, since I talked about release, where release means we're going to push it out and we're going to run it on the platform. So two different options. Since I had my container before, I could run a job that's going to push it out to Azure Container Instance, one of the services on the platform. Since I'm talking about a web app that also needs SQL, I'm going to push it out as well. Now, in a, I would say, more traditional DevOps scenario, you as a developer probably going to reach out to the ops team, like, can you prep my Azure environment? So if I go back to my Azure scenario, I have a resource group for the meetup here. And within, I have my placeholders for my web app development environment. Come on. Oh, that's portal was a bit slow. Let's try once more. Come on, Portal, you can do this. And up here, it's waiting for code. So we go back to our DevOps environment, and we're going to create a new release pipeline. I can start from, again, a pre-configured template, or let's make it a bit more intuitive and build everything myself. So push to Azure or whatever name you want to give it. My artifact is what I compiled in the build stage, where it allows me to pick up any specific version, typically the latest one, because that's the latest one you build, but nothing blocks you from going back in time based on certain characteristics. And from here, we're going to build up a release task, which again is just a sequence. And this time we're going to pick deploy to Azure App Service. What I need from here is obviously Azure credentials, where I can't show you live because I'm apparently out of service principals. But what I'm going to do is creating a service principal in Azure, or asking my security team to offer me the credentials I need and allowing me to build up my connection between Azure DevOps and my Azure backend. That's what I already did. And I'm going to push this out to the meetup. Oh, I deployed it as a Linux one. .NET Core Linux makes perfect sense, but it's not showing up. Let's give it another push. There we go. Oh yeah, I defined Linux on the other project. That's what happened. And that should be more than enough. Good. So what it's going to do is similar to the build pipeline, running a sequence of tasks if I push my release button. But that's maybe not, I would say, the smartest option. So let's move back to our pipeline, because now I'm directly pushing to production, right? So that's maybe not something we want. So let's create a new stage. It's again, app service deploy, but this time we're going to do push to dev and test first. It's the same subscription. You could obviously connect to a dev and test subscription, and this time I'm going to push it out into my dev space. Making sure I'm saving the changes, but it's not 100% correct because I'm first pushing to prod and then to dev. So we're going to make this into another change. And why not? We could clone it. We could copy it out. And again, specifying some other settings. So that's all quite straightforward. So we don't need this for a second. And this is dev, so that's fine. And this one goes after this one. There we go. So now I push the button, it's going to start rolling, deploying it, but we could make it even more intuitive. So what we can do is defining pre and post conditions. I don't have the time to walk you through all the details, but what it means is, for example, you can inject approvals. Interesting about approvals is that it just needs an email address. So depending a bit on how you define your project, it could be private, could be public, typically for like open source, user group alike scenarios, or mixed, where you can invite members out of your organization, Azure AD integrated, for example, or just anyone. Now, the benefit is from here that I could, for example, send an approval request to one of my team members, maybe my senior supervisor, but he's not really into DevOps. So I want to make sure that he doesn't need to know that much about DevOps. So I could send an email, or at least send an invite. It's going to trigger an email. My supervisor receives that email, clicks on it, validates, approves it, and that's the next step in the process. Or why not moving it into dev and test first? And once the dev and test is done, I'm going to put a halt on my production based on a setting or a feature that we call release gates. A couple of options you can define here is interacting with the backend. Again, I'm using Azure, but it's not limited to Azure. You could validate Azure policy. If you're not familiar with Azure policy, it's a governance instrument allowing you to validate, for example, what kind of web app service plan are you defining? What kind of region are you using to run your web app? And maybe I'm pushing it out to West Europe, but there is a compliance policy that I cannot run my production environment in West Europe. I could define a validation in here that before my pipeline starts running, at least for the production stage, that it's going to validate, hey, Azure policy, what's the feedback? And if anything goes wrong, it's not even trying to push it out. Or triggering an Azure function, running a REST API call, and that gives you like almost unlimited capabilities. Imagine that you want to validate the performance. I talked about performance in my introduction. Setting the scene, your e-commerce platform, you sized it for 300 visitors, but thanks to COVID, you got like 3,000 visitors every day. And that could be the trigger where your Azure function could validate the health state of your environment, or Azure Monitor, but that's again a Azure specific example, where it's going to learn from your environment, picking up real-time information. There's a delay about 5 minutes. That's the lowest you can go. If after the first 5 minutes, after pushing the deployment, the state is, let's say, red, like something's wrong in the platform, it's going to wait 5 minutes after, or 15 minutes, or whatever timing you define. It's going to validate again. And let's say the Azure region is back, or the performance is back, or the REST API feedback is like a 200 successful. It means you're good to go and the deployment will run. I talked about Azure boards at the beginning, our project management. So one of the core capabilities is work items. And that's where you're going to define who's going to do what in my project. Where next you could run a query, like for example, how many open work items does Peter have? And if there's more than 50, it means he's not at all ready to run a deployment. So that's another nice integration. Or the last one here, integrating with Sonar Cloud, one of the so many tools allowing you to run source control, security integration, where it's going to scan the code, providing feedback. You got outdated packages, you got outdated code, like in my example, you got too many bug items as an open scenario, and I'm going to block you from deploying it. You could add more items from the Azure DevOps Marketplace. So let's see how we're doing on time. Oh, scary. I talked about the pipelines, showed you how it's working, using the templates, using the classic approach, the YAML approach, and you could mix and match. So nothing really to worry about. Selecting your subscription, creating a new one, and it's going to run your pipeline. Next, I talked about making the deployment smarter, more intelligent, picking up a release gate control, using the manual approval, pre and post, perfectly fine. Any of these examples, and integrating with any other third-party plugin that allows you to make this deployment a lot more intuitive and a lot smarter. One other scenario is where you can validate a full end-to-end scenario. So I'm going back to one of my pipelines, because what I did up till now is pre-building my environment on Azure, asking my ops team, can you build a web app instance? Can you prep the virtual machines and everything that I need? But what if I would be able to integrate the two worlds together? So that's another example I have here. And that's what I'm going to push out. And then I think we can almost switch to Q&A. But just showing you how you can easily integrate the two worlds, devs and ops, together. So instead of prepping my environment somehow offline, I would say, like the ops team is doing their part of the job, the dev team is doing their part of the job, like running the web app deployment, I can now combine everything. Out of the build stage out of release, or again, combining the two worlds. For example, I'm triggering Azure CLI. What I'm doing here is running a script. I could build a script itself and then pointing to it, or integrating the script in my pipeline. From here, I'm creating an Azure resource group. That's what I'm doing in the first step, and picking up some variables. Next, I'm creating a SQL server, adding some firewall settings for my SQL server to make it secure. And that's step one. That's building the baseline. From there, I'm going to run another script, and this could be PowerShell, CLI, Python, anything else, where this time I'm going to run SQL database create with some database specifics, creating my app service plan, and creating my fresh web app instance. And then last, I'm going to run some SQL backup restore integration, something that's typically done by the operations team. The scripts are already there. I've been using these Azure scripts for years, and now I'm just copy pasting them and turning them into a pipeline. And again, if this is Azure PowerShell or anything else, that would also work. It's still classic. If you go for, let's say at some point I want to integrate in a more newer approach, I want to use YAML, click View YAML. We're now, since only this week, actually totally new, the YAML integration is somehow moved. So we need to go back to our pipeline overview, if I remember correctly. And from here, we can export to YAML or exporting to JSON. There's two different options there. Some YAML sample. And I should have another one somewhere. Oh, there we go. Another example that I copy pasted from the GUI, moving it into YAML. So again, that full migration path is also available. So just for the fun of it, I'm going to run a full scenario. So it's integrating Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, picking up the artifacts, picking up the build pipeline, and pushing it out. I'm going to run a little bit over time, so sorry for that, but I hope you still enjoy it. Answering one of the key questions, and I'm quite sure that anyone in the audience came up with a question already, so I'm going to try to be first. What's going on with GitHub Actions? And is it a replacement for Azure DevOps? Do we still need to spend time on learning Azure DevOps? As you know, I've been delivering training for quite a while. And since I started delivering Azure DevOps training a bit more than a year ago, this was a question that comes up in every single delivery Monday morning in the first 5 minutes. Now, GitHub Actions is awesome. Honestly, it's awesome. But for now, I would say, comparing it with Azure DevOps, it's not exactly the same. So in short, when you start using GitHub Actions, the source control needs to be GitHub, where Azure DevOps is supporting a lot of other Git compatible scenarios. I talked about Azure DevOps boards, so the project management tool. We don't have that kind of integration in GitHub Actions yet. There's no reporting, not a lot of dashboarding, like getting a view on what's happening, sharing a lot of information there. No release gates. So everything I showed you about that, making your deployments more intuitive, smarter based on the feedback of the platform. It's not there. Approvals were not in pipelines, but I have to correct my slides, and actually did. Just need to update the date. It's not December 15th. It's actually last week during the keynote of GitHub Universe. They announced that approvals are part of the platform, which means that out of GitHub Actions, you can start integrating approvals. Not exactly in the same way as it works for Azure DevOps, but again, it's finally there. And overall, I would say GitHub Actions is perfectly fine for a workflow pipeline-based concept. If you look for that broader development tool, DevOps tool, integrating the different worlds together with everything from project management, artifacts, and everything else, I think for now, Azure DevOps is probably still better. And if you've never seen GitHub Actions in action, so you start from your GitHub repo. That would be your starting point. And for example, from here, I could create some Docker image based on a Docker file, and I can trigger an action. There's a whole list of pre-configured templates, a little bit similar to the pipeline concept that I showed you in Azure DevOps, where from here, I could pick a template and it's producing me a YAML file. It's going to tell me all the different actions I can take. If I want to go back and let's say I'm not doing anything with Docker, no idea where that comes from. It's like my whiteboard is doing some weird stuff here. Let's start with a new workflow. And it's all YAML based, so that's, again, that nice overflow, I would say, from Azure DevOps Classic Editor, starting to train yourself on learning YAML because it's becoming the default for GitHub Actions. And just showing you what's capable around Azure or AWS or anything else, but let's use Azure since I talked about it for about an hour. I could automate my Azure deployments. I can run container registry integration, deploying Azure Web Apps, and anything else you're looking for. So let's pick Azure Web App. It's producing a sample pipeline. I could, like it says here, copy paste the YAML. And again, it could be a nice integration. You might have teams working with GitHub Actions today, where you go like, well, sorry, but we've been using Azure DevOps for so long. Nothing blocks you from integrating the two worlds together. Perfectly fine. So with that, I'm not going to take more time away because I want to give you some Q&A time. So in short, again, it's only 45 minutes, but Azure DevOps supports your DevOps concepts, the mindset, the flow. Although it has Azure in the name, it's not limited to Azure deployments. It's allowing AWS, Google Cloud, on-prem systems, doesn't matter. Azure pipelines, the step-by-step task automation process, makes your life a lot easier from the DevOps world into developer world, into ops, integrating the two worlds together, standalone pipelines, integrating pipelines. You could even create nested pipelines where you have a collection of pipelines and eventually gluing them all together, moving to dev test scenarios, from there moving to production, integrating approvals, the quality gates, and the little teaser about GitHub Actions, where tackling the main question, Azure DevOps is far from being dead. With that, I'm done. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. Note that my pipeline is still running in the back, and depending a bit on how many questions we have, you could actually see the full successful deployment.
Well, cheers, Peter. Yeah, so far it looks like we've only had one question from Rodrigo. He asks, does Azure DevOps have a visual dashboard that combines multiple projects, even from different project collections, so that we could bring to a business meeting or change a committee meeting so that we could review all releases and take decisions for the go live?
So out of the box, but it's not enabled for this project, but I think I might have another example. So out of the box, there's a couple of dashboards available, and this is just something I quickly pushed together. So it's going to show you the state of the releases, the builds, and everything in between. Each and every release, like this was dev and test environment Q&A, moving to production, moving to second production in a different cloud environment. Now this works. You can do a lot more with this. You could also extend it with, again, the marketplace, Azure DevOps Marketplace plugins, but it's always per project. So there's no easy way to compile like a one nice looking dashboard that's going to work across all projects. Okay. At least not out of the box. So you have the Azure DevOps API. So a lot of what I showed you can actually be monitored, managed out of the APIs. So even Terraform released a provider only a few weeks ago, allowing you to actually build Azure DevOps environments using Terraform and not using Azure DevOps to deploy Terraform templates. So actually pretty mind-blowing. But if you know a little bit about interacting with APIs, nothing would stop you from building your own dashboard. Integrating with Teams, for example, is another popular one with Slack and building up some feedback dashboards there. So I would say the capability is somehow available, but not immediately out of the box.